In the vast expanse of human history, there are certain figures who stand apart like towering mountains on the horizon. They are not merely rulers of their own age, but shapers of civilizations whose decisions echo across centuries. Among them, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, occupies a singular place. Born as Zheng in 259 BCE, he rose from the heir of a small state to become the unifier of the warring kingdoms of ancient China. His story is one of ambition, vision, and relentless drive. Yet it is also the story of an age, of a people searching for stability after centuries of war, and of the enduring legacies of culture, philosophy, and empire. To understand Qin Shi Huang is to journey into a world both familiar and profoundly foreign. It is the 3rd century before the Common Era. The lands we now call China are not yet one nation, but a patchwork of rival states, bound together by shared traditions, yet divided by bitter enmity. This was the time of the warring states, when alliances shifted like the winds, and great armies marched endlessly across plains and valleys. It was an age of profound suffering for ordinary farmers and artisans, yet it was also a crucible of innovation in governance, warfare, and thought. Philosophical schools such as Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism flourished in this turbulent environment, offering competing answers to the question of how human beings should live and how rulers should govern. Into this storm, Ying was born. The young prince inherited the throne of Qin at just 13 years old. The state of Qin lay on the western edges of the Chinese world, sometimes regarded by its rivals as a frontier realm. Yet this seeming disadvantage gave Qin both resilience and a distinct character. Through generations of reform, Qin's rulers had built a disciplined military and an efficient bureaucracy, drawing upon the principles of legalist philosophy, which emphasized law, order, and centralized authority. It was this foundation that enabled the young king to dream not only of survival, but of conquest and unification. As we drift gently into the narrative, imagine the landscapes of early China. Rivers like the Wei and the Yellow carved their way through fertile valleys, where peasants tilled the soil with wooden plows and oxen. In the villages, life was shaped by the rhythms of the seasons, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, and enduring the biting cold of winter. Wooden houses stood in clusters, smoke curling from clay stoves, while children played in courtyards. Yet above these modest lives loomed the specter of war. Armies could arrive without warning, fields could be burned, and entire populations might be uprooted or conscripted. This was the world that demanded unification, a world crying out for stability. Qin Shi Huang, upon reaching maturity, launched campaigns that gradually overwhelmed his rivals. By 221 BCE, he had brought the last of the warring states under his control. It was then that he declared himself not merely king, but Huangdi, the first emperor, adopting a title that suggested both divine authority and a new beginning for China. In doing so, he redefined what rulership meant. No longer would China be a loose collection of competing states. Instead, it would be one empire, with a centralized administration, standardized laws, weights, measures, and even written script. In these reforms lay the foundations of what would become, for millennia, the Chinese imperial system. But Qin Shi Huang was not merely an organizer of state. He was also a man of grand visions and deep anxieties. He ordered the building of monumental projects, the most famous being the early Great Wall, linking together regional fortifications to create a vast line of defense against nomadic peoples from the north. He commanded the construction of roads that stretched like veins across his empire, facilitating trade, communication, and the swift movement of armies. And he envisioned an eternal rule, seeking elixirs of immortality and sending expeditions across seas in pursuit of mythical islands. His tomb, guarded by the famous terracotta army of thousands of life-size soldiers, stands as a testament to his desire for power beyond death. Yet there is also a darker side to this tale. Qin Shi Huang ruled with an iron hand. He trusted few, relied on harsh punishments, and sought to control not only the actions, but the thoughts of his subjects. Books were burned, scholars executed, dissent suppressed. For all his achievements, he remains a figure of controversy, remembered both as the unifier who gave birth to China as a nation and as a tyrant who crushed individuality beneath the weight of empire. As we unfold this story together, we will not rush through the centuries. Instead, we will walk calmly through each chapter of his life and legacy. We will explore the world into which he was born, his rise to power, his unification of the realm, and the reforms that reshaped daily life. We will linger with his vast building projects, imagining the hands of countless laborers lifting stones under the sun. We will consider the intellectual world he both feared and relied upon. And finally, we will reflect upon his death, his enigmatic tomb, and the centuries of interpretation that followed. In this gentle exploration, we will seek not drama, but understanding. Qin Shi Huang's life was filled with battles, but our journey will focus less on the clash of weapons and more on the enduring consequences of his reign. We will attend to the details of life under his rule, the systems he established, and the ideas that defined his age. Through this calm narration, like the steady flow of a river, we may drift into sleep with a sense of connection to the deep past, where the first emperor dreamed of eternity. The origins of the Qin State form the soil from which the extraordinary figure of Qin Shi Huang would one day emerge. To understand the character of the first emperor, we must first dwell in the rugged lands of his ancestors, among mountains, river valleys, and frontier fields, where the seeds of reform, discipline, and ambition were carefully sown. The state of Qin began as a relatively minor polity during the Zhou dynasty, situated on the western edges of what was then regarded as the civilized world of ancient China. To the east lay the older and more established states, steeped in traditions of ritual, hierarchy, and Confucian learning. Qin, by contrast, was viewed by many as a peripheral land, rough and militarized, closer to nomadic tribes than to the cultivated aristocracies of the Central Plains. Yet what some considered a weakness turned out to be the state's greatest strength. Qin's frontier character demanded resilience, adaptability, and a willingness to innovate in ways that older states, bound by tradition, resisted. The geography of Qin contributed much to its identity. Nestled between the Wei River Valley and the rugged uplands of the west, its territory included fertile fields watered by tributaries of the Yellow River. These lands supported a growing agricultural population, but they also faced constant threats from neighboring tribes and rival states. Unlike the sheltered plains of the east, Qin's borders were exposed, requiring vigilance and military readiness. From early times, the people of Qin became known for their hardy soldiers and stern commanders. But geography alone did not account for Qin's later ascendancy. During the 4th century BCE, Qin benefited from the guidance of reformers such as Zheng, a statesman who brought with him the principles of legalism. Legalism was a school of thought that placed order, law, and strict control above all else. Unlike Confucianism, which stressed morality and tradition, or Taoism, which sought harmony with the natural world, legalism emphasized clear laws enforced by harsh punishments and rewards as the surest way to govern human behavior. Zheng introduced sweeping changes. He redistributed land, rewarding peasants who farmed efficiently, and encouraged a merit-based system in which individuals could rise through service rather than noble birth. Military service was incentivized, and aristocratic privileges were curtailed. For the common people, these reforms brought both hardship and opportunity. Life was tightly regulated, and failure to obey the law could lead to severe punishment. Yet peasants who worked diligently could now gain land, and soldiers who performed bravely could be rewarded. This meritocratic edge gave Qin an army that was both disciplined and motivated. It also produced a bureaucracy that cared less for pedigree and more for results. In a time of constant warfare among the states, these qualities gave Qin an immense advantage. Imagine for a moment the daily lives of Qin's farmers during this era of reform. They rise at dawn to tend their fields, guided by the agricultural calendar. With oxen and simple wooden plows, they cut furrows into the soil, sow millet, wheat, and barley, and in some regions, rice. The state requires taxes, usually in the form of grain, and keeps careful records through its officials. Military conscription is a looming reality. Many young men expect to serve in campaigns, wearing armor of leather and carrying crossbows, a weapon that Qin armies perfected. Life is not easy, but there is the sense that order is being imposed on chaos, that the state is strong enough to defend its people, and ambitious enough to promise greatness. The Zhou dynasty, under whose umbrella the Qin state initially grew, was by this time weakening. The authority of the Zhou kings had long since eroded, and the once unified feudal order had dissolved into the competitive world of the warring states. This gave Qin room to expand its influence. While Eastern states clung to traditional rituals and lineages, Qin stood apart with its emphasis on practical governance. This difference bred disdain from rivals who dismissed Qin as backward. Yet in reality, Qin's policies were laying the groundwork for what would eventually allow it to triumph over them all. The rise of Qin was not without internal strife. Reforms such as those of Yang were deeply unpopular among the nobility, and resistance often erupted. Yang himself fell victim to political intrigue, executed despite his service, a reminder of the volatility of court politics. Yet the essence of his reforms endured, embedded in Qin's structures. Generations of rulers after him would continue to strengthen the legalist foundation, gradually transforming Qin into a formidable power. As we drift further into this formative period, it becomes clear that the story of Qin is not merely about warfare and politics, but about resilience and adaptation. Its people lived close to hardship, frontier raids, unpredictable harvests, and the burdens of heavy labor. Yet they also carried within them a sense of destiny. The frontier state was not content with survival. It aimed for supremacy. Every tax record, every grain collected, every sword sharpened, and every reform implemented moved Qin closer to its future. It is in this crucible that Ying, the boy who would one day be known as Qin Shi Huang, was born. He inherited not only a throne, but a tradition of reform, discipline, and ambition that had been forged over centuries. The origins of Qin had prepared the way for his extraordinary reign, just as the rivers and mountains had shaped the land. The story of the first emperor, then, is also the story of this remarkable state, whose frontier toughness and legalist discipline would allow it to do what no other could, unite all under heaven. And so, as we close this first reflection, let us imagine ourselves standing on the western frontier, looking eastward across the patchwork of rival kingdoms. To the untrained eye, Qin may still appear as just one state among many. Yet beneath the surface lies a force that will soon transform the entire world of ancient China. The wind carries the sound of soldiers drilling, peasants harvesting, and scribes recording the details of taxes and conscription. From such ordinary rhythms will come an empire that dreams of eternity. The story of Ying, who would later be known as Qin Shi Huang, begins not in triumph, but in uncertainty. His early life is marked by the turbulence of war, palace intrigue, and the daunting challenge of kingship assumed far too young. To understand his character, we must first drift back into the world of a boy whose destiny was to inherit the throne of Qin at just 13 years old. Ying was born in 259 BCE, during the final decades of the Warring States period. His father, King Zhuangxiang of Qin, ruled briefly and somewhat precariously, while his mother, Lady Zhao, was herself entangled in the political complexities of the court. Legends later embellished his parentage, with rumors suggesting scandal and uncertainty about his father's role. Yet such tales often emerged from rival states seeking to diminish his legitimacy. What is certain is that Ying entered the world at a moment when the Qin state stood on the brink of its greatest opportunities, yet was still vulnerable to external enemies and internal dissension. As a child, he lived in the palace at Xianyang, Qin's capital. Picture the palace halls. Wooden beams rising high, bronze vessels gleaming in torchlight, courtiers whispering as they moved along echoing corridors. The boy king grew up surrounded by ritual, yet beneath the ceremony lay constant danger. At court, ministers jostled for influence, generals schemed for glory, and family factions vied for control. It was not a safe place for innocence. Even at a young age, Ying would have sensed the precariousness of his position. When his father died in 246 BCE, Ying was thrust onto the throne at the tender age of 13. Too young to govern independently, he became reliant upon regents and advisors. Chief among them was Lu Buwei, a powerful minister and merchant of immense wealth, who had maneuvered to bring Ying father to the throne and now sought to dominate the young king's reign. Lu Buwei filled the court with his allies and acted with the confidence of a man who believed himself indispensable. Yet his ambitions also made him dangerous, and in time, Ying would learn the lesson of dealing with overmighty subjects. For now, however, The boy king had little choice but to trust in the structures around him. His daily life was one of ritualized study and training. Tutors instructed him in the principles of law and governance, in the history of the Qin State, and in the military strategies that would define his adulthood. From a young age, he was steeped in the legalist philosophy that guided Qin's rise, learning that power rested not on moral example, as Confucians might say, but on strict law, discipline, and the centralization of authority. Such ideas would shape his thinking profoundly. Yet being a king in his early teens also meant a measure of isolation. The burden of responsibility hung heavily upon him, even if others acted in his name. One can imagine him walking through the gardens of the palace, gazing at the distant hills, and wondering how he might someday live up to the weight of the crown. Behind every ritual and every lesson lay the awareness that his state was surrounded by powerful enemies. Chu to the south, Zhao to the north, Wei and Han to the east. Any sign of weakness might invite attack. Thus, even as a boy, Ying knew that vigilance was essential. The regency of Lu Bue, though stabilizing in some respects, also created instability. Stories circulated about his influence over Lady Zhao, the king's mother, and about the intrigues of eunuchs and other courtiers. Later historians would portray this period as one of corruption and danger, painting a picture of a court where ambition threatened the throne itself. While some details are colored by hindsight and political bias, there is no doubt that the young king grew up in an environment where trust was scarce. This experience may help explain the suspicion and authoritarianism that would later define his rule. As Ying reached his later teenage years, he began to assert himself more directly. He proved keenly intelligent, watchful, and determined to free himself from the shadow of his regents. Slowly, he began to gather loyal officials who believed in the vision of Qin's unification. Among them were men such as Li Si, a brilliant administrator who would later play a central role in consolidating the empire. The young king's ability to recognize talent and draw it into his orbit became one of his greatest strengths. Daily life in the palace under Ying would have been a mixture of the mundane and the monumental. Meals of millet, pork, and vegetables, served in lacquered bowls, alternated with councils of war and lessons on governance. Festivals and rituals continued to punctuate the calendar, connecting him to the traditions of his ancestors, even as he prepared for a future that would overturn much of the old order. He learned to ride horses, to handle weapons, and to command soldiers, for no king of Qin could rule without military prowess. By the time Ying reached adulthood, he was no longer the passive boy king of 13. He was a ruler in his own right, determined to assert control over his court and his destiny. Lu Bue, sensing the young man's growing independence, fell into decline. Eventually, he was forced into retirement and died in disgrace, a victim of the very ambition that had once carried him so high. Ying had survived his vulnerable youth, and in doing so, he had learned lessons about power, loyalty, and the dangers of dependence. As we pause here, we can reflect on the extraordinary transformation from boy to king. Ying early life was not one of carefree childhood, but of constant vigilance, political intrigue, and the cultivation of discipline. In the quiet corridors of the palace, he learned that survival demanded strength and that authority must be seized, not merely inherited. These experiences prepared him for the moment when he would step fully into his role, not as a passive monarch controlled by others, but as a king who intended to shape history itself. The gentle rhythms of the palace, the rustling of silk robes in torchlight, and the echo of footsteps in long corridors carry us forward. Soon, this young king will turn his gaze outward, beyond the palace walls, to the wider world of rival states. The boy who survived intrigue and regency will become the man who conquers kingdoms. The campaigns that would unify China under Qin did not begin as sudden bursts of conquest, but as carefully orchestrated efforts that unfolded across decades. Ying, having secured his authority within Qin, now turned his eyes outward. The rival states that had dominated the political landscape of the Warring States period. Zhao, Yan, Han, Wei, Qi still stood. Each had its own proud traditions, generals, and fortifications. Yet all were weakened by centuries of conflict, and none could match the discipline and organizational strength of Qin. This was the moment the young king seized. The Warring States period had lasted for nearly 3 centuries. Alliances rose and fell, armies clashed across fertile plains, and scholars debated the philosophies of governance while ordinary farmers endured the devastation of conscription and war. By the time Ying reached adulthood, exhaustion was widespread. Populations longed for stability, yet rulers clung to their independence. Qin's advantage lay not only in its powerful military, but in the legalist reforms that had made the state efficient. Every man counted, every acre of land was registered, and every grain of harvest was tallied. Such precision meant that Qin could mobilize resources on a scale no other state could match. Ying and his ministers, including the brilliant strategist Li Si, crafted a deliberate plan for conquest. They would attack in sequence, targeting weaker states first, isolating stronger ones, and using both military might and political maneuvering to bring down their foes. In this strategy, patience was as important as aggression. Qin armies moved like waves, steady and relentless. The first target was the small but strategically located state of Han. Positioned between Qin and the eastern states, Han was vulnerable. In 230 BCE, Qin forces overwhelmed Han, bringing it into their domain. For the common people of Han, the conquest meant new rulers, new laws, and the imposition of Qin's strict system of administration. For Qin, it was the essential first step, opening the way eastward. Next came Zhao, a state with a proud military tradition. Zhao's cavalry had once been the terror of the plains, but by the late 3rd century BCE, its strength had waned. Qin armies marched north, and after a series of campaigns, Zhao fell in 228 BCE. In this conquest, Ying displayed both ruthlessness and foresight. Loyal generals were rewarded, but dissenters were crushed. The lands of Zhao, with their fertile fields and important strategic location, now became part of the growing Qin domain. Yan and Wei followed, each succumbing to Qin's superior organization and unyielding armies. In 225 BCE, Qin engineers demonstrated their ingenuity by diverting the waters of the Yellow River to flood the defenses of Wei's capital, forcing surrender. This tactic revealed Qin's reliance not only on brute force, but on clever manipulation of the environment. Against such resourcefulness, rival states found themselves outmatched. The most formidable opponent was Chu, a vast state in the south with abundant resources and a tradition of proud independence. The campaign against Chu was long and arduous. Qin generals faced strong resistance, but eventually, after fierce battles, Chu too was brought under Qin control in 223 BCE. The fall of Chu was a decisive moment, for it meant that only Qi remained unconquered. Qi, once powerful, had chosen a policy of cautious neutrality, hoping that by avoiding confrontation with Qin, it might survive. Yet this strategy proved fatal. By 221 BCE, Qin forces marched into Qi with little resistance, and the final obstacle to unification vanished. For the first time in history, the lands of the Chinese world were united under a single ruler. Ying's conquests were not merely military victories. They represented the end of an age of fragmentation and the dawn of a centralized empire. His declaration as Huangdi, the first emperor, marked a profound shift. Where once there had been kings ruling states in uneasy balance, there was now one emperor ruling an empire. The very language of power changed, as emperor suggested a cosmic and eternal authority beyond the limits of ordinary kingship. For the ordinary people of the newly conquered territories, the unification was both disruptive and transformative. On one hand, they endured the hardships of war, homes destroyed, families separated, fields ravaged. Yet with Qin's consolidation came new possibilities. For the first time in generations, there was the promise of stability. Taxes were standardized, laws applied uniformly, and trade could move more freely along the roads Qin built. Though life remained difficult, the end of constant warfare was itself a profound change. Imagine traveling across these newly unified lands in the aftermath of conquest. One might begin in the north, where the remnants of Zhao's cavalry traditions linger, pass through the flooded plains once defended by Wei, move south into the lush regions of Chu with their rich poetry and music, and finally arrive in the east, in Qi, with its coastal winds and seafaring traditions. All of these diverse cultures, once separate, were now bound under a single authority. Though differences remained, the emperor's vision of unity began to shape them into a whole. Ying Zheng's campaigns demonstrated not only the might of Qin's armies, but his own determination. He was not content to be one king among many. He sought to be the only ruler, the center of a new world order. In this, his ambition went beyond the politics of his age. He redefined what rulership meant, setting the template for imperial China that would endure for centuries. As we pause here, it is worth reflecting on the gentle but firm transition from chaos to unity. The clash of armies has faded into memory, leaving behind the calm of a land no longer divided. Villages rebuild, farmers return to their fields, and children grow up without the constant fear of armies at their gates. The sound of swords is replaced by the steady rhythm of plows in the earth. This is the peace that Ying Zheng's conquests, for all their brutality, have made possible. The boy who once walked anxiously through palace corridors is now the master of all under heaven. His rise is complete, but his story is far from finished. For unification is only the beginning. The true test of his vision will lie in how he governs this vast new empire, how he reshapes daily life, and how he ensures that his rule endures beyond his lifetime. When the last of the rival states fell and Ying Zheng claimed dominion over the land, a transformation took place that was more than political conquest. In 221 BCE, he declared himself not merely king of Qin, but Huangdi, the first emperor of a unified China. This new title signified a rupture with the past, a deliberate step into uncharted realms of authority. Where kingship had been limited to regional rulers in an unstable world, the title of emperor implied universality, permanence, and cosmic mandate. Ying Zheng was no longer simply a king among equals. He was the embodiment of order itself, the center of all under heaven. The decision to adopt the title Huangdi was steeped in symbolism. It combined Huang, the word used for the legendary three sovereigns of antiquity, and Di, a term linked with the revered five emperors. By merging these, Qin Shi Huang cast himself as the heir to mythic antiquity, bridging the world of legend with the present. In doing so, he was asserting that his authority transcended the boundaries of any previous king. This was not a dynasty as usual, but the beginning of a new world order. From the imperial palace at Xianyang, the emperor now issued decrees that reached across thousands of miles. Imagine the scene. Scribes bending over bamboo slips, carefully inscribing the emperor's words in black ink. Couriers racing out along the new network of roads, carrying the orders to distant provinces. Officials in every region bowing low before the seals of imperial command. The machinery of government spread outward like the spokes of a wheel, with the emperor himself as the hub. In his early acts as emperor, Qin Shi Huang sought to erase the divisions of the warring states era. He abolished the old feudal system that had bound rulers to hereditary territories. Instead, he divided the empire into administrative districts governed by officials directly appointed by the throne. This change ensured that loyalty flowed upward to the emperor alone, not sideways to regional lords. To ordinary people, this meant that allegiance was now owed not to a local noble, but to a distant central authority. Taxes, laws, and military obligations were standardized, bringing a sense of order, but also a sense of distance. Ceremonies reinforced the majesty of the new imperial title. When Qin Shi Huang traveled through his empire, it was with elaborate processions, columns of soldiers, banners fluttering in the wind, and attendants carrying the insignia of state. The people would kneel as the imperial carriage passed, their fields momentarily forgotten as they caught sight of the ruler who now claimed the mandate of heaven. That ancient belief held that a dynasty's right to rule was given by heaven itself, justified by its ability to maintain harmony and order. By presenting himself as the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang was announcing that heaven's favor had shifted permanently to him and his line. But the creation of the emperor's role was not only a matter of ritual and law, it was also an intellectual shift. In a world long divided, the very idea of unity was radical. The emperor's court propagated the concept that China was now one body, indivisible, and that its people shared in a single destiny. This ideological leap, as much as the conquests themselves, gave permanence to Qin's achievement. It established the framework upon which later dynasties would build, even when Qin itself had long since fallen. The emperor also sought to express his authority through monumental building projects that embodied the scale of his new title. At Xianyang, palaces were expanded, with vast halls lined by colonnades and courtyards capable of hosting thousands of officials. His presence was amplified not just by words, but by stone, timber, and earthworks that proclaimed the power of the state. Each project was both a practical undertaking and a symbolic declaration. The empire itself was vast, enduring, and firmly under his control. Yet, for all the grandeur, Qin Shi Huang remained intensely pragmatic. His adoption of the imperial title was accompanied by reforms aimed at ensuring that his rule would not be undone by the weaknesses of past dynasties. He distrusted hereditary nobility, preferring to appoint officials based on merit and loyalty. He reinforced the legalist system of governance, believing that only strict laws could hold together the immense diversity of his subjects. This legalist outlook emphasized collective order over individual freedom, and though it created resentment among scholars and aristocrats, it provided the structural backbone for an empire of unprecedented size. For the common people, the birth of the first emperor was felt in subtle ways. Taxes were collected more efficiently, roads were patrolled more regularly, and borders once plagued by raiders were fortified. Farmers continued their lives of sowing and reaping, but now they did so under the certainty that their labor fed not just a state, but an empire. Artisans, too, found their skills in greater demand, producing weapons, armor, and the materials for imperial projects. For many, the transition was not immediate revolution, but gradual adjustment to the new order. It is important to remember, however, that Qin Shi Huang's transformation of kingship into emperorship was not universally admired. Rival traditions, especially Confucian scholars, criticized the harshness of legalist rule and mourned the loss of older traditions of governance. Some saw the emperor's insistence on centralization as excessive, stripping away the independence of local customs and imposing a uniformity that erased diversity. Yet such criticism was muted under Qin's firm control, and in the moment, the tide of history favored the emperor's vision. As we reflect, we see that the creation of the emperor's title was more than a political maneuver. It was a profound reshaping of identity. China was no longer a land of contending states. It was a single empire with one ruler at its center. That idea, born in the mind of Qin Shi Huang, would endure for over 2 millennia, carried forward by countless dynasties long after his own had fallen. Drifting gently from this chapter of triumph, we can imagine the stillness that follows the storm of conquest. Across valleys and rivers, peasants till their fields under new laws, while distant officials write reports to a capital they may never see. The emperor himself, robed in silk and crowned with authority, contemplates the vastness of the realm now his. In that moment, he is not merely Ying, the boy who survived intrigue and youth. He is Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, dreaming of eternity. With the empire newly established and the title of emperor secured, Qin Shi Huang turned his attention toward weaving his vast territories into a coherent whole. Conquest alone could not hold the empire together. To endure, it required shared systems, common measures, and reliable networks of communication. Thus began one of the most remarkable phases of his reign, the great standardizations, the building of roads and canals, and the unification of writing, weights, and laws. At the heart of these efforts lay a belief in order. The emperor and his ministers, especially Li Si, recognized that diversity across the former states, different currencies, varying laws, and multiple scripts could lead to confusion and rebellion. Standardization, though demanding and often resented, promised stability. The empire, stretching from the northern plains to the southern rivers, could be bound together not only by military force, but by the shared rhythm of daily life. One of the most significant reforms was the standardization of weights and measures. Before unification, each state had used its own systems of counting and measuring. For traders and farmers, this created endless disputes. A bushel of grain in one region might differ from a bushel in another. A foot of cloth might stretch longer or shorter depending on local custom. Under Qin Shi Huang, bronze weights were cast with imperial inscriptions, and measuring rods were distributed to ensure uniformity. This reform touched every household, as merchants in distant markets could now trade with confidence, knowing that a measure of grain meant the same in Chu as in Zhao, in Qi as in Qin. Currency, too, was standardized. In place of the varied forms of coins, Some shaped like knives or spades, others cast in irregular pieces of metal. The emperor introduced a round bronze coin with a square hole in the center. This banliang coin became the official currency of the realm, easy to string together on cords for larger transactions. Imagine a farmer carrying a small string of such coins to a market, or a caravan of merchants transporting larger bundles along the roads. The uniform currency facilitated trade, knitting together distant regions into an interconnected economy. Perhaps most transformative of all was the unification of the written script. Across the warring states, diverse regional characters had developed, making communication difficult. Under the emperor's decree, the small seal script was adopted as the standard, replacing regional variations. Scribes and clerks were trained to write in this new form, and bamboo slips bearing uniform characters began to circulate through the bureaucracy. The importance of this reform cannot be overstated. It meant that decrees from the capital could be read and understood across the empire, and it ensured that the written culture of China would have a consistent foundation for centuries to come. To this day, the continuity of Chinese script owes much to Qin Shi Huang's vision of unity through language. Alongside these reforms, the emperor oversaw vast infrastructure projects. Roads were built in a radial pattern extending outward from the capital at Xianyang, like the spokes of a wheel. These roads were not narrow paths, but broad thoroughfares, some wide enough to accommodate 6 horse-drawn carriages abreast. They were paved with packed earth and gravel, lined with ditches for drainage, and marked by milestones that indicated distances in uniform measures. For armies, the roads meant rapid deployment across vast distances. For merchants, they offered new opportunities for trade. For officials, they allowed reports to travel swiftly, binding the provinces more closely to the central government. Equally important were the canals. Qin engineers dug waterways that connected rivers, allowing for the transport of grain and supplies. These canals not only fed the needs of the military, but also supported agriculture by irrigating fields. One famous project, the Zhengguo Canal, transformed the fertility of the Guangdong region, ensuring that the Qin heartland could feed its growing population. For ordinary people, these changes reshaped daily life in subtle but profound ways. A farmer in the south might now sell grain measured by the same bronze weight as a merchant in the north. A traveling official could carry imperial orders that would be read without confusion in every province. A soldier marching along the imperial roads would know that the milestones measured distance the same way across the entire empire. These reforms fostered a sense of belonging to something larger than a local village or state. They were now part of a single, unified empire. The laws, too, were standardized. Qin Shi Huang's legalist philosophy demanded uniformity and predictability. No longer would different regions operate under different codes. Instead, a single set of laws governed all subjects, enforced with the same severity, whether one lived near the capital or on the far frontier. This consistency created order, though it often brought fear. Punishments were harsh, ranging from forced labor to mutilation or death. Yet for the emperor, severity was not cruelty, but necessity, the surest way to ensure obedience in a vast and diverse population. The vision underlying these reforms was not merely administrative. It was also symbolic. By imposing uniform systems, Qin Shi Huang was proclaiming that the empire was one body, guided by one mind. The roads and canals were its arteries, the laws its bones, the script its voice, and the emperor its heart. This metaphor of unity gave coherence to a realm that had once been divided, and it laid the groundwork for centuries of imperial rule. As we let these images settle into place, we may imagine ourselves traveling along one of these new roads on a quiet evening. The sun dips low over the fields, oxen pull carts laden with grain, merchants call out their wares, and an official's carriage passes swiftly, bearing orders sealed with the imperial stamp. At each step, the world feels ordered, connected, and bound together by a system larger than any individual. This is the quiet genius of Qin Shi Huang's reforms. They touched every detail of life, binding the empire not just by power, but by shared practice. The emperor's vision was immense and his reforms enduring. Yet even as he sought to unify daily life, he also dreamed of reshaping landscapes on an even larger scale, pushing beyond fields and markets to walls and mountains. That, however, belongs to the next chapter of our journey. Having unified laws, measures, currency, and script, Qin Shi Huang turned to projects of even greater scale, works that not only organized daily life, but transformed the very landscape of China. Chief among these were the defensive walls, later linked into what would become the Great Wall, and the extensive building programs that projected imperial power into the farthest reaches of the realm. These undertakings were feats of human labor and engineering that astonished contemporaries and have echoed through history. The northern frontier was always a place of tension. Beyond the cultivated lands of the empire lived nomadic peoples, tribes who moved with their herds across the grasslands and who often clashed with sedentary farmers. For centuries, states had constructed local fortifications, rammed earth walls, watchtowers, and moats to deter raids. Qin Shi Huang, determined to secure his vast new realm, ordered that these regional defenses be joined and extended, creating a continuous line of protection stretching across northern China. The project required staggering amounts of labor. Hundreds of thousands of conscripts, including soldiers, peasants, and convicts, were sent north to toil on the walls. They worked with packed earth, stone, and timber, building long embankments across mountains, valleys, and deserts. Imagine the scene. Endless lines of workers carrying baskets of earth, tamping it down with wooden tools, and raising walls that snaked over ridges and plains. Watchtowers rose at intervals, their fires ready to send signals across vast distances. The work was grueling, and conditions harsh. Many perished from exhaustion, exposure, or hunger, their bodies buried within the very earth they raised. The Great Wall, as we think of it today, is largely the product of later dynasties, especially the Ming. But Qin Shi Huang's vision was its origin, and his efforts created the first great chain of defenses. To those who lived in the shadow of the wall, it was both a source of security and a symbol of the emperor's reach. To future generations, it would stand as one of the most iconic markers of China's civilization, a reminder of the ambition of its first emperor. The walls, however, were only one part of Qin Shi Huang's construction efforts. Within the empire, he ordered the building of roads and canals on a scale that knit together regions once separated by natural barriers. These roads radiated outward from the capital like the veins of a body, enabling soldiers to move swiftly to quash rebellion and merchants to carry goods across vast distances. The canals connected rivers, providing irrigation for fields and routes for transporting grain to garrisons and cities. The empire's infrastructure became a living organism, pulsing with the energy of commerce, communication, and control. In the capital, monumental palaces and administrative complexes rose. The emperor envisioned Xianyang not merely as a seat of power, but as a symbol of unity, filled with representatives from all corners of the empire. Courtiers, officials, and envoys gathered in its halls, their voices echoing against painted beams and lacquered columns. The capital itself was a testament to the emperor's belief in grandeur and order, a stage upon which the drama of imperial authority was played for all to see. For the common people, these projects were both awe-inspiring and burdensome. Conscripted labor demanded sacrifice. Farmers were taken from their fields, leaving families to struggle through harvests. Convicts and prisoners of war were pressed into service, their labor repaying debts to the state. While the walls and roads promised protection and prosperity, the immediate cost was hardship and suffering. Legends and later histories often painted the emperor as a tyrant for these demands, and tales of lives lost in construction became part of his dark legacy. Yet from a broader perspective, these works forged connections that allowed China to endure as a unified civilization long after the Qin dynasty itself had vanished. The emperor's building projects were also deeply symbolic. To build walls was to declare the permanence of the empire, to draw a line between civilization and chaos. To build roads was to announce that all regions were now part of one order, bound to the capital and the will of the throne. These undertakings embodied Qin Shi Huang's belief that human effort, when directed by authority, could master nature itself. Mountains could be cut through, rivers redirected, deserts crossed. The empire was not merely a political entity, but a reshaped landscape. If we pause and listen closely to this world, we might hear the sounds of picks striking earth, of carts creaking under loads of stone, of shouted orders carried by the wind across plains. We might see lines of weary workers trudging homeward after a day of toil, their shadows long in the setting sun, while soldiers patrol the construction sites to maintain discipline. Above all, we might sense the weight of ambition pressing down, the determination of one man to leave behind a legacy written not in words, but in earth and stone. The Great Wall and the vast network of roads and canals remind us that empire is not only about conquest, but about endurance. These constructions created the physical framework for a civilization that would last for millennia. Though Qin Shi Huang himself would not live to see their long-term effects, his vision of binding the land together through monumental works became an enduring feature of Chinese history. As this chapter closes, we may let our minds drift along those roads, through valleys softened by twilight, past the looming silhouettes of walls stretching into the distance. The empire lies quiet, its people resting after labor, while the first emperor dreams of eternity. The stones and earth bear silent witness to a ruler who sought to reshape the world itself. Even as Qin Shi Huang celebrated the grand works that unified his empire, he turned his attention to another realm, the thoughts and beliefs of his people. For the first emperor, it was not enough to rule bodies and lands. He wished also to command minds. The world of ideas, with its multitude of philosophies and teachings, could inspire loyalty or spark dissent. In this delicate arena, he made choices that would mark his reign with both power and controversy. The intellectual life of China in the Warring States period had been extraordinarily rich. Confucians emphasized moral virtue, filial piety, and the proper ordering of relationships. Taoists encouraged harmony with nature and the search for balance. Mohists advocated for universal love and practical benefit. Legalists, meanwhile, stressed strict laws and punishments as the only sure path to order. In this vibrant landscape, debate flourished, and rulers often patronized scholars to legitimize their reigns. Qin Shi Huang, however, was wary of ideas that challenged his authority. He leaned heavily on legalist advisors such as Li Si, who argued that diversity of thought encouraged division. For an empire to endure, Li Si reasoned, it needed one law, one script, one measure, and one way of thinking. Philosophies that glorified past dynasties or emphasized moral authority over state law could inspire opposition. Thus, the emperor moved to suppress them. The most famous episode was the burning of books. In 213 BCE, decrees were issued that non-practical texts should be destroyed. Works on agriculture, medicine, and divination were spared, for they contributed directly to the functioning of the state. But texts of philosophy and history, especially those praising Confucian ideals or recalling the ways of earlier dynasties, were ordered to be burned. The aim was clear: to erase competing visions of governance and leave only the authority of the present. Imagine the scene. Scholars watching as bamboo slips and bound scrolls were piled high and set alight, flames consuming centuries of learning. The air filled with the crackle of fire, the scent of charred lacquer, and the quiet despair of those who had devoted their lives to study. For the emperor, it was a necessary act of consolidation. For generations of thinkers, it was a tragedy that symbolized tyranny. The following year, according to some sources, came the execution of scholars accused of defying imperial authority. Numbers are uncertain. Later records speak of hundreds buried alive, but the message was unmistakable. Independent thought that challenged the emperor's supremacy would not be tolerated. Whether these accounts are literal or exaggerated, they reflect the atmosphere of fear that descended upon intellectual life under Qin. For ordinary people, the impact was mixed. Farmers and artisans continued their daily routines largely unaffected by philosophical debates. They measured grain, sowed fields, crafted tools, and paid taxes. Yet the absence of diverse teachings in schools and official life meant that generations grew up with legalist doctrine as the dominant voice of governance. Obedience, discipline, and uniformity were instilled as virtues, while questions of morality and tradition were pushed to the margins. Still, the emperor's efforts at control were not absolute. Families preserved oral traditions, local teachers continued to pass on stories, and ideas never vanished completely. Beneath the surface of uniformity, China's intellectual traditions endured, waiting to re-emerge when the empire's grip weakened. Later dynasties would revive Confucianism and Taoism, shaping Chinese culture for centuries. Yet the memory of Qin's harsh measures lingered, coloring the emperor's legacy. There is, in this story, a paradox worth contemplating. Qin Shi Huang sought to build an eternal empire, and in pursuit of permanence, he attempted to silence the voices of the past. Yet by destroying books, he became remembered as the ruler who feared knowledge. By executing scholars, he came to symbolize the dangers of unchecked authority. His efforts to erase diversity only ensured that later ages would debate and reinterpret him endlessly. As we drift gently through this chapter, we can envision the contrast. In one hall, the order of uniform laws and decrees, clerks writing identical characters on bamboo slips. In another, the quiet absence where once philosophers might have debated ethics and governance. The silence of suppressed voices becomes almost audible, a reminder that control can achieve order, but often at the cost of creativity. For the emperor, control of thought was a way to safeguard unity. For history, it is a cautionary tale. The empire he built endured only briefly, but the intellectual traditions he sought to suppress survived, blossoming again in later centuries. In the quiet of night, as we let these reflections settle, we sense the tension between order and freedom, authority and wisdom, a tension that echoes across ages. The flames of book burnings fade into memory, the voices of scholars are stilled, and the empire continues under the watchful eyes of officials. Qin Shi Huang dreams not of debate, but of eternity. Yet even in silence, ideas live on, waiting for their time to return. Even as Qin Shi Huang secured the empire through walls, laws, and roads, his thoughts turned increasingly toward time itself. The first emperor, though master of all under heaven, remained subject to the same truth as all mortals. The body ages, life ends, and death arrives without mercy. For a ruler who had unified the world, this was intolerable. His ambition stretched beyond borders into the realm of eternity, leading him on restless quests for immortality. The emperor's concern with death was not unusual for his age. In ancient China, rulers often sought elixirs and rituals to prolong life, inspired by legends of immortals who dwelt in distant mountains or across the seas. Taoist traditions spoke of alchemists mixing herbs and minerals into potions, and of mystical islands where the blessed lived free from decay. For Qin Shi Huang, these tales were more than stories. They were possibilities to be pursued with all the resources of the empire. He summoned alchemists and magicians to his court, demanding potions that might extend his life. Some concoctions used mercury, cinnabar, or jade, substances thought to hold transformative power. Ministers assured him that with the right balance of ingredients, immortality could be achieved. He drank these mixtures faithfully, even though, as we now know, mercury was poison rather than cure. To him, each potion was a step closer to eternity. But the emperor's quest did not stop at the palace. He dispatched expeditions to distant seas, searching for the mythical isles of the immortals. Historical records speak of envoys sent eastward with fleets of ships, carrying hundreds of young men and women, artisans, and scholars. Their task was to find the islands of Penglai and Fangjiang, where sages were said to possess secrets of eternal life. These voyages, shrouded in legend, never returned with elixirs. Some say the envoys chose to settle in new lands rather than face the emperor's wrath. Others believe they wandered the oceans in vain. Yet the image remains. Ships sailing eastward into mist, their sails taut with the hope of immortality. Closer to home, Qin Shi Huang undertook pilgrimages to sacred mountains. Mount Tai, long revered as a place where rulers communicated with heaven, became the site of elaborate ceremonies. There, he performed sacrifices and left inscriptions proclaiming his divine authority. These journeys were more than religious acts. They were staged declarations that his reign was sanctioned by heaven and that his power extended beyond earthly limits. To his subjects, such rituals reinforced the idea that the emperor was not merely mortal, but touched by the divine. Despite these efforts, the emperor remained haunted by the inevitability of death. He grew increasingly suspicious of those around him, fearing plots and betrayals that might hasten his end. Palace intrigues deepened his anxieties, and his reliance on alchemists and astrologers revealed his desperate hope that some secret might save him. The empire might be eternal, but he longed for eternity to reside within himself. For ordinary people, tales of the emperor's search for immortality spread as both marvel and caution. Some whispered of magical journeys, others mocked the futility of seeking to escape death. Farmers and craftsmen, bound to the cycles of planting and harvest, understood the natural rhythm of life more readily than their emperor. Yet they, too, participated in the rituals, offering sacrifices at altars, watching processions to sacred peaks, and marveling at the scale of imperial ceremonies. The emperor's longing for eternity also influenced the monumental tomb being built for him during his lifetime. While this belongs more fully to the story of his death, the construction of his mausoleum, guarded by thousands of terracotta soldiers, was itself part of his vision of immortality. If life could not be extended indefinitely, then memory and presence could be preserved in stone, clay, and earth. The tomb was not only a preparation for the afterlife, but an attempt to create a world where the emperor would remain sovereign forever. In reflecting on this chapter, we sense both the grandeur and the fragility of Qin Shi Huang's quest. His achievements in unification were unmatched, yet his fear of death made him vulnerable, chasing after potions that harmed rather than healed, sending ships on journeys with no return. In the stillness of night, one can imagine him pacing through his palace chambers, the moonlight casting long shadows, while alchemists whisper promises of eternal life and courtiers await his command. The search for immortality is, in many ways, a deeply human desire. Qin Shi Huang, though emperor, was not exempt from the universal longing to escape mortality. His wealth, armies, and walls could not shield him from the truth that life is finite. And so he sought, with restless energy, to break through the boundaries of existence itself. As we allow these reflections to settle gently, we might imagine the soft lapping of waves against the hulls of ships bound eastward, their crews gazing into the horizon in search of unseen islands. Or we might picture the quiet mixing of potions in palace chambers, the shimmer of mercury in lamplight. The emperor dreams of eternity, and yet, like all of us, he walks steadily toward the end. In the final years of his reign, Qin Shi Huang remained restless. Despite the walls that stretched across mountains, the roads that linked distant provinces, and the reforms that bound his people together, he could not escape the weight of mortality. His travels grew longer, his demands harsher, and his fear of death more pressing. In 210 BCE, while on a journey through eastern China, the emperor's search for eternity reached its end. He died near the coast, far from the capital he had built, leaving behind an empire both monumental and fragile. The circumstances of his death are recorded with somber detail. Accounts suggest he was traveling in search of one more elixir of life when illness overtook him. Surrounded by courtiers and officials, his attendants sought to conceal his passing, fearing unrest if news spread before arrangements were secure. To mask the odor of decay during the long return journey, carts of salted fish were added to the procession. The emperor, who had sought to control every detail of his realm, could not control the final truth of his own body. Yet while death silenced the man, it did not end his influence. For years, even as he lived, thousands of workers had labored on his mausoleum near modern Xi'an. Buried beneath a massive mound, the tomb was designed as an underground palace, complete with rivers of mercury to mimic flowing water. Ceilings studded with jewels to represent the stars, and chambers filled with treasures for the afterlife. Most striking of all was the terracotta army, thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, each with unique features arranged in precise formation to guard their emperor in death. Imagine descending into that silent army. Rows upon rows of warriors stand ready, their faces distinct, their armor detailed, their expressions solemn. Horses, chariots, and weapons once glinted in the torchlight of artisans who worked year after year to shape them. Though they were never meant to be seen by living eyes, they now stand as one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries in history. In their stillness, they whisper of an emperor who dreamed of command beyond the grave. The tomb complex was more than a burial site. It was an extension of Qin Shi Huang's vision of eternity. If life could not last forever, then memory could. The emperor would be accompanied by an army larger than any in life, secure in a palace crafted beneath the earth, his sovereignty preserved in death as in life. For his successors, and for later generations, the tomb symbolized both the grandeur of his ambitions and the cost of his obsession. Yet, despite his monumental achievements, the dynasty he founded did not endure. Within a few years of his death, rebellion erupted. Harsh laws, heavy taxes, and the burdens of labor had left deep resentment. Without his unyielding will, the Qin dynasty faltered. By 216 BCE, it collapsed, giving way to the Han dynasty, which would refine and soften many of Qin's harsh policies while retaining the foundations of centralized empire. Qin Shi Huang's reign had lasted little more than a decade as emperor, yet its imprint would shape China for millennia. His legacy is paradoxical. To some, he is remembered as a tyrant, the burner of books and barrier of scholars, a ruler who crushed dissent and demanded obedience at any cost. To others, he is the unifier, the visionary who ended centuries of war and gave China the framework of empire that endured. In truth, he was both, harsh and brilliant, ruthless and enduring, a man whose ambitions outstripped his years. His reign reminds us that greatness often carries shadows, and that the drive to control can create both stability and suffering. For the ordinary people of his time, his death brought both relief and uncertainty. Farmers continued to till their fields, merchants continued their trade, and artisans continued their craft, but the sense of overwhelming authority that had hovered above them began to waver. The emperor's laws still bound them, his roads still guided their steps, his walls still marked the horizon, but the living force behind them was gone. As centuries passed, Qin Shi Huang became a figure of legend. Stories grew around his search for immortality, his armies of clay, and his ruthless laws. Poets and historians alike debated his nature. Was he the architect of civilization or the destroyer of freedom? Archaeological discoveries, from the terracotta army to the remains of his palace, have only deepened the fascination. He endures as a figure larger than life, as much myth as man, standing at the threshold of history and legend. To reflect on his legacy is to reflect on the nature of power itself. He unified a land, yet could not unify eternity. He reshaped laws, measures, and roads, yet could not reshape the human condition. He dreamed of immortality, yet found only memory. And perhaps memory is the truest form of immortality. For more than 2,000 years after his death, his name still resonates, his story still told, his image still studied. In this way, he achieved the eternity he sought, not in his body, but in history. As we close our journey, let us return to the image of the terracotta army, standing silent in the dark earth. They do not march, they do not speak, yet they keep watch. In their stillness lies the echo of a ruler who sought to command forever. Above them, the soil of China nurtures crops, villages, and generations that followed, living lives far removed from imperial ambition, yet shaped by the structures he built. And so, in the calm of night, as our thoughts settle into rest, we may let Qin Shi Huang fade gently into memory. His empire rose and fell, but the idea of China as one land, one people, one order under heaven remained. His life was a testament to human ambition and to its limits. He dreamed of eternity, and in memory, perhaps he found it.